And so I am not Kim, if you were dialed in today to listen to her, but my name is Steve Winterfeld. I'm with Akamai, and occasionally when we have research or a hot topic come out, Kim has allowed us to guest host. And so today I'm guest hosting with my partner in crime, Sean. And
Good afternoon.
So again, I'm the CISO advisory CISO for Akamai, and I'm really excited to help drive our research and share our research. Sean, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm a director of strategy. A lot of what I get to do is make sure that the products that we have are meeting today's challenges, but we're also looking at the threat landscape and new technologies that companies are adapting so that we're prepared to create the next new security solution for the challenges that might take place tomorrow.
So as something emerges like, oh, let's just say what's everybody talked about. So we're a minute in, we probably should talk about AI. So I'm sure you guys are already looking at that, but let's step back and say, as we talk about this, what kind of research does Akamai do?
So for something like a state of the internet report, we really bring together a lot of our research groups across lots of different areas. Those people who have field tested knowledge, cybersecurity professionals representing like researchers, operations professionals, product architects, data scientists, incident response. And we focus on the technologies that we are gathering threat intelligence with. So, for example, the Akamai platform does a lot with application and API security. Also, as you mentioned, generative AI or large language models. And then we also have solutions that are gathering intelligence within the enterprise area. So segmentation and inside what's, communication going across a network. As well as, always protecting against, the latest and greatest DDoS attacks that are out there, that that trend that just never goes away.
Yeah, and I will tell you, a lot of people know for Akamai for our stuff on DDoS, some of the largest DDoS attacks out there, those kind of things. And as we look at this, this is a kind of a new report for Akamai. As I was reading through it, much longer than the traditional State of the Internet reports. The one that just came out is called The Defender's Guide to 2025, Fortifying the Future of Your Defense. And it seems like it's kind of a different focus on this one. Talk to me a little bit about what's new with this report.
So in the past, a lot of our reports were geared around more of a executive audience. It's more on trends at a higher level. This is really one of the first reports where we're really getting into the details that like a level one analyst or somebody who's actually on kind of the front lines of securing their network and their applications could use. So it's providing a lot more technical information, providing a lot more technical examples, and talks about how to defend against what we're looking at as like the modern attack trends that we're seeing in the early 2025.
All right, so that makes sense. Kind of the first report of the year, very technical, very tactical. Something that people on those, as you called it, front lines could actually use to turn around and instantly say, how are we defending better? Right. Walk me through almost at a table of contents level, kind of what's in the report.
So it really can be broken down into three sections. The first one being risk management, which really kind of covers how companies are looking at establishing risk, which is, to say, you'd want to understand or basically put a dollar sign on a risk, whether that's a vulnerability that somebody might take advantage of, or if it's deciding to build a data center in Miami, for example. There's a risk to everything, and everybody wants a dollar amount to that. So that's really what risk management's kind of about. Then there's the network architecture piece, which is really focusing on some of the vulnerabilities and some of the way attackers are taking advantage of network layered attacks. And then it goes into host security and focuses very much on kind of the latest and greatest technology and how attackers are taking advantage of that.
So that makes sense. The first one's kind of big strategic picture, what the threat's doing, how we're looking at the enterprise, and then how we're looking at the endpoint. All that makes sense.
Yeah.
So as a CISO, I'm not on the front lines. I'm not in there, protecting individual servers. And for those folks listening who day in and day out deal with active threats, why should they care about this report? Why should they care about what we're talking about today?
Because I think it exposes a lot of trends that we're seeing right now. So, it reveals how the real world attacks are evolving. It also connects like the vulnerabilities that we hear about to the actual attacks that are the outcomes that we're seeing. And it also identifies what I would consider common mistakes that defenders are still making. So trends where you think that this is something that isn't new, should have been fixed, isn't being fixed.
Yeah, you're going to make me get up on my soapbox and talk about OWASP again today, aren't you?
Possibly, yeah.
And I will say,
go ahead.
I will say, when I look at OWASP, and for those that don't know, OWASP is a nonprofit organization out there that looks at common vulnerabilities. And many years ago, the thought process was, let's prioritize what our cyber hygiene is, what blocking and tackling we're focused on. And so if there are the most common things that are breaking into networks, let's start by making sure we're not making those mistakes. And just everybody say, okay, get rid of these 10 most common things and we're in good shape. And I think the first OWASP came out in 2003. The top 10, I want to say there are 4 of them that are still on there. Injection attacks, broken authorization, misconfiguration, and cross-site scripting. Yep. Are any of those you're going to talk about today?
Yes, I am.
So there we go. We're right back there. I will also highlight that I love OWASP because it, from that first one, obviously, I think there's 5 or 6 different iterations. APIs are becoming more and more common, and APIs are kind of that technical interface for applications. And so those have their own set of vulnerabilities because there are some that are unique to that infrastructure. And then recently they came out with the large language model top 10 for generative AI, and that changed. I think within 1 year they had already updated that list. So all that to said, it's interesting that we're back there. So I got off on a rabbit trail. Let's get back. Talk to me a little bit about that first section, risk management.
So the report really goes into kind of stating that the old way of doing risk management really isn't that accurate. And that there's a new way out there, and that's what Akamai is going into in this report, is kind of a new way to do it. So I'll make a kind of an analogy here. The old way of doing it would be kind of like if you were going to do a risk assessment of a house, right? Your house. You might walk around and count how many windows you have and how many doors you have, and you might try to calculate out the total value of all the valuables that you have lying around or wherever they are. And then you might start looking at what might be the risk. Like a door can, the lock can be picked, a window can be broken, maybe the fire alarm or the burglar alarm can fail, right? And then at that point, you kind of use your gut and use past experience. And in many instances, you're using kind of a spreadsheet kind of format that lots of different companies have, and they're never the same as far as what they value and what they don't. And you come up with this calculation as to what each one of these risks amounts to. And it's not accurate. It's very static, meaning if things change, the risk usually stays the same. The new way of doing it is, imagine doing the exact same thing, but now your house has sensors, smart sensors that are monitoring how often the front door is being used and the side door is being used, monitors how often windows are open, how often they're locked, can calculate the time it might take for a robber to go from one room to another, and can identify valuables that you have just lying around versus valuables that you have maybe that's a lot harder to find. Maybe they're in a safe or in a mattress or under a bed or something like that, right? So by doing it that way, you're going to have a lot more realistic of an outcome. And not only that, so we're looking at more of a practical real-time taking in things like access, but it also means that you could get a better score if you increase your security. So if I am the homeowner, I say, okay, well, I noticed that my door's unlocked during the day. I'm just going to lock it now. Well, that could actually impact my score. If I say I'm going to take all my valuables and hide them better, the score is going to get better because it's a lot more realistic. We're taking into consideration how fast somebody can get access to these devices and what's the likelihood of that.
So, if I have my garage door and my side door locked, but not the door to my house locked, then I say, okay, I want to be more secure. I lock the door to my house. Well, every time I go to the garage now, I have to remember to bring a key. That's more friction. So there is something that I need to like have that. And, in the past, you're right, it's been more gut feel. Is a automatic garage door opener easier to spoof? And for those of us who have been to some of those hacker conferences, the answer is yes. And so maybe I want to reduce the risk, or maybe I do something like, to take it to your network analogy, segmentation, and instead of my wife having a jewelry box, we get a jewelry safe.
Right.
Maybe it's fingerprint versus dial lock, so it's more user friendly. Maybe my coin collection, and yes, I am outing myself as having a coin collection. Maybe that doesn't need to be in a safe because its dollar value isn't that high. So going back to the network, yeah, maybe, as this report points out, and I'd encourage you guys to look at the reports. It has some fantastic graphics in it that makes a lot of this more intuitive. But if only 3% of my servers have very valuable information, or if we're using, more modern architecture and it's deployed code like Kubernetes or something like that, if those deployed code modules, those are probably what I need to care about if they have critical data, customer data, sensitive data like PCI or something on that. So all that makes a lot more sense if I can do that in an automated way. And then I love that the report talks about if there are configuration changes, that may change the level of risk, because we all know whenever you make changes, there's chance for errors, there's chance for leaving, a window unlocked that you thought was locked. So is that all a fair analogy to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's taking it into a more realistic realm, right? So, how many servers do you have that are actually accessing the internet? I mean, that should matter. How many of the internal servers that you have is your normal internal network accessing? There's some servers that are very active and others that aren't, and that should be taken in consideration. So yeah, I think that's a good analogy there.
And then the second half was around malware. So help me understand what malware is and which type of malware is kind of top of mind right now.
So malware is being able to implement some sort of code into a machine at a level where it can take control of the machine, or at least execute some sort of script code, whatever, on the machine itself. So think about ransomware. I think everybody's kind of very sensitive to ransomware. Ransomware is a variation of or a format of malware. It's a type of malware. So a lot of the malware is designed to get into a system and then spread to other systems. That's really kind of the purpose. And then at that point, the modern malware typically would go out to the internet and get commands. So it's something that can be deployed, and then the attacker can actually update what the malware needs to do, and it goes ahead and does it. The report had some really interesting trends that kind of indicate that we need to do a better job of patching. One of the first things it talks about is a Shodan scan that happened back in January of this year, so only a couple months ago, which told us that about 22 million servers out on the internet are open to something called Secure Shell or SSH. And Secure Shell, think of it as like a command line access to a server. So you're going straight into the server, and it's all accessible on the internet. Now,
yeah, that reminds me of those of you that are old enough to have watched War Games. That's a scene where he's, breaking in and typing, and it's like, list the games, and it lists all the games, and it's that direct interaction with the system. Well, then he can say, play the game, delete the game, download the game, and steal it. But it's in there with complete authority.
Yeah.
So that's a very, very dangerous vulnerability to leave open. And for those of you who are Shodan, I don't encourage you to go look at it. It's in a bad neighborhood on the internet. It's kind of like Google for hackers. So while it is interesting, go there with caution.
Yeah, or let the researchers do it and then get the data from there. Because hopefully they're taking all the, we expect them to take all the necessary precautions when they do that. And it also, that particular information also shows that the United States is leading in as far as how many servers are vulnerable. So there are a little over 6 million servers that the United States has that's vulnerable, and this is not a new vulnerability. The idea of being able to reach a machine through SSH has been around for a very long time. This is something that should have been closed off pretty much, before I got into cybersecurity over 20 years ago, right? So this isn't new. So it's concerning that we're not patching the way we should. Some of the other things that we looked at from looking at our own honeypots that's kind of monitoring internal networks is, we're seeing ransomware attacks that are using malware, and they're communicating on very common ports that are still successful. So common ports like remote desktop protocol and Secure Shell and a couple of others should probably be locked down on a network. Most of the time, most companies aren't really using them, or they're using them in a very restrictive way, or at least they should be. So to have them be able to move across a network using these ports and protocols, and the fact that they're still successful, means that there's still some work to be done as far as securing the network. The other piece is about the different types of malware that we're seeing, and a lot of it's actually kind of a revamp of old malware, right? So we've got, the report talks about the Noah bot, which is a Mirai variant. And Mirai botnet's been around for, probably 10 years. So
that's a denial of service one, right?
Exactly. And it operates off of Internet of Thing devices that had hard-coded usernames and passwords. So unfortunately, when those usernames and passwords leaked, there was no way to change them. So all these like cameras and other things that were kind of Internet of Thing devices or IoT devices became part of the botnet. And now we're also seeing additional like routers that have been that are no longer supported. Things like that are being kind of added to this Mirai botnet. But what this is doing is it's focusing on using weak or stolen passwords. Again, it's going to focus on SSH, that thing that we keep going back to. And it's updated with new code, and evasion techniques. So it is making an effort to avoid antivirus. The second one, which I think is a little more aggressive, is something called Fritz Frog. And I'd love to meet the person who comes up with these names. But Fritz Frog is, again, it's doing brute force on SSH. It's designed to slip past the defenses, move laterally across the network, and it hunts for unpatched internal systems. And you would think, well, what it's doing is it's using some very old vulnerabilities, or not very old, but we're talking about 4 or 5-year-old vulnerabilities. And it's successful because a lot of the patching approaches that companies are using is they're thinking in terms of what servers have internet access. So we'll patch those servers because they can be contacted through the internet, or they can be, you can get into them by the internet, but they're leaving the ones that don't have internet access vulnerable. Well, this thing is now inside your network, and it's able to use those vulnerabilities to get in, and then at that point, it's able to initiate commands and spread across the network. And then the last one is Redtail, and Redtail is kind of different because it's actually focusing on crypto mining malware. So it's designed to get into known vulnerabilities, and occasionally it might even use a 0-day, meaning something that hasn't even been discovered yet as far as the vulnerability. So it's brand new. We haven't had a chance to kind of to patch it. And then it sets up shop to mine crypto. So think of it as a very smart, persistent parasite that is kind of latching onto the computer resources, and is then using those resources to crypto mine.
It's interesting you say that. 0-day used to be one of our terms, and I felt like I would have to tell everybody what it is, but now it's a movie on Netflix. So I think that one has probably entered the mainstream lexicon. But the crypto mining, if I understand what you're saying, then is they're breaking into a system to leverage it as a resource to do crypto mining.
Exactly.
And that's crazy, I'm always impressed by the innovation that cyber criminals come up with. It was ransomware was around, and then it disappeared for about 15 years. Now it's back, really aggressively. We see DDoS has been around for years, and yet we're putting out new reports on DDoS because of change in speed and scale and complexity. And, here we have these bots, and I know bots are sold as a service now, and it's crazy to think about all of this innovation going on. But I like to highlight within this report, it's a chance to say, if I've got a small business, do I have SSH open? That's a quick configuration check I can go do. If I'm a larger company, I can go look at my logs and say, am I having experience getting the kind of attacks I'm reading about in this report to understand, am I within the norm of what's being attacked? Or maybe I look and I don't have any of this. And now I'm a little worried that, do I not have visibility on the kind of attacks I should be expecting? So I appreciate those insights. The next section was network architecture. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So the first thing it's going into is some vulnerabilities that we're finding in VPNs, and VPN stands for virtual private networks. I think most people probably have come across them, especially if you were, especially during COVID, when you were working from home, you probably used a VPN to connect to your company. So typically it's a way to securely connect to your company, whether it's in a remote office, like our satellite office, or you're working from home. And it's designed to kind of create a secure connection so that you can,
that tunnel, private tunnel. Yep.
Tunnel is a great, yes. And what we're seeing is that there are certain VPN software that you can take advantage of to go ahead and either exploit some of the weaknesses or vulnerabilities within it, or actually take over that machine based off of those vulnerabilities, or maybe even get credentials from the VPN software. So we're looking at things like authentication bypass, which really is allowing them to get in and get admin control, even if they don't have the credentials, or remote code execution. And this is, we were talking about OWASP top 10, injection code is, I think, number 2. And then there's also ways to extract the configuration data which a lot of times has like LDAP credentials or SSH keys or API tokens. And it's kind of like one more thing that kind of adds to the argument of getting away from from VPNs, which is a very old school approach to connecting to companies. It's kind of looking at taking a computer and connecting it to a network. And I think the technology's been around for at least 20 years. There are new ways to do that. There's safer ways to do that. And so these vulnerabilities are kind of like one more reason to get away from VPNs if you haven't already.
And it's a two-edged sword. I think at some point, there are a lot of, in fact, I just had one of the people I used to work for reach out, and, she wanted to know, hey, I was thinking about maybe having a VPN for my home system to do some, increase in security there. And I said, I like Proton, and I think she's going to implement that. And that's the kind of thing, if you're out there doing research and you want that protection kind of to isolate so people can't identify you as easily. So I think VPNs have a place. But if you're using it and you're trying to go to the next level of security, I agree that, it's time to consider moving to the next generation of security, because we continue to see FBI, releasing warnings about, the latest VPN, whether it's a protocol or a vendor-based VPN, warnings on that. So that's some good advice.
Attackers are also focusing on those things for things like you talked about distributed denial of service or DDoS. One of the big targets is focusing on that VPN server or that VPN connection, because they know if they bring it down, it impacts how people can do business. And you're right. I do have a different opinion on a VPN for home use, which I think is a good thing, versus companies' VPNs, which I think are kind of old technology. That we have solutions out there. There's lots of companies that have zero trust network, access solutions that are focusing more on bringing the user to an application versus connecting a computer to a network, which a lot of times gives you way too much access to a network. And we've seen attackers again and again focus on the VPN as a way to get in.
So what was the next one?
So the next one is really kind of a deep dive into a very common attack that we've had forever in application security, which is cross-site scripting. And to kind of simplify this, cross-site scripting is a kind of a trick that hackers would do to make a website run hidden or harmful code. And they usually do that by slipping it into places where the site lets people type things in. So think of like a search bar or a comment box. And if the website doesn't check for it and clean it up, the hacker's code can get executed through there. And then once the bad code runs, it can steal your username or password. It can mess with what you see or what you click on. Or secretly download things like malware onto your computer. So in the past, it was pretty easy to spot this because it kind of jumped out at you if you were looking at the code. And a lot of times hackers might kind of test this by creating code that would simply have a pop-up appear. But what we're seeing now is that attackers are moving, so they're still using cross-site scripting, but they're focusing on concealing it much better. They're using something called JavaScript, and they're doing a better job of getting around what we consider security solutions that might be scanning for this. So it's a way to kind of disguise it to make it look like traditional JavaScript, or they can try to disguise it to make it look like regular text. So there's a lot of ways that they're able to kind of do this in a much sneakier way, I would say, and be able to execute that code.
Yeah, and that goes to one of the challenges as we look at our broader network. We have our web pages out there, and then we have a JavaScript environment, and then we have that Kubernetes environment that we're going to talk about later. And back if you're working for a major bank, you still have a mainframe. So a lot of this is about understanding, we've fixed cross-site scripting in this area, but now it's showing up in another area. How are we detecting it? How are we protecting this different environment? It gets very complex very fast. And that kind of drives back in my mind to that need for overall training of our coders. Because, you know, broken authentication, injection, cross-site scripting, local file inclusion. Most of this stuff to me is around good coding practice, good hygiene, and it's just so vitally important to make sure we're doing this right.
Yeah.
And
So go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was say so much of it can be removed. So much of these vulnerabilities can be removed if you're just sanitizing input information. You know, then you're cleaning it up, and it doesn't get executed. So, you know, if coders are sanitizing anything that can be inputted into the application, then you don't have to worry about the cross-site scripting, the SQL injections, the remote code executions. That gets taken care of.
And so the last section, talk to me about the host security.
So host security is really focusing on what would probably be considered the newest technology. It's been out there for a while, but it's the newer technology when it comes to hosts, which is Kubernetes and containers. And really, to put it simply, Kubernetes is a way to deploy code without needing to kind of own and have the servers below it, right? That's why it's the reference, and you might hear the word container, and that's pretty much what it is. And just like the trend that we typically see whenever there's new technology out there is that security kind of is the second thought. So what we were able to find and kind of highlight on this report was really 6 major vulnerabilities and flaws that attackers are currently using to take advantage of those vulnerabilities within Kubernetes, to allow them to do things like run their own commands inside the system, or access parts of the network that they shouldn't be able to, gain higher permissions to take over more of the system, steal computer resources. Again, this goes back to cryptocurrency. This is a trend that we're seeing. So this is another one where they're looking to steal computer resources so that they can do crypto mining, or move through the environment and kind of attack other systems nearby. So they kind of use it as like point of entry so that they can spread across the network. Ransomware is a great example of where that would be likely to happen.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, you know, I have that default mindset of when you say host, I think of the laptop on my desk. And here we're talking about host as anywhere that now, I used to have a server, now you called it a container, you know, this module of code that's running that same stuff the server does. As a CISO and the CIO, I love that because it means I don't have to maintain the server. I can just run the code. But it does change the skill sets I need, the tools I need to do that securely. And the other thing I always worry about is, you know, do I have the right tools to do an investigation? Do I have the right tools to do an audit? If it's just deployed code, you know, what kind of logs do I have? All of that stuff. Because as you talk about all this, I'm thinking about how do I monitor it? How do I remediate it? How do I kind of think through this? So are there common mistakes that are being done here?
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get into that, I'm going to play devil's advocate and say, and to be fair, it's not just simply the companies that are using the new technology. It takes time for security vendors to also create solutions around that. And we do see, and I would say, especially in the finance industry, where we see a lot of DIY type, you know, do-it-yourself type solutions that they had to create because there wasn't a solution for them when they needed it. So to be fair, I think it's kind of a shared problem between, you know, it takes time for security vendors to be able to adapt and add and create security solutions for this new technology. But also, you know, the other side, you got to be fair there. A lot of times it takes even longer for them to go ahead and utilize that.
And that's very true with APIs, with Kubernetes, with large language models. it's the skill sets and the tools
Yep.
to be able to understand how to secure them, what we need. All of that is very true.
Yep. There are typically what we see like three common mistakes that that happens when you that we see within a Kubernetes environment. The first one is really not checking what's going in, right? So some setups don't properly check the data going into them. Hackers can take advantage of that by sneaking in commands that the system then runs, right? The next one is, and this we see this actually in several different scenarios, giving too much access. Where many environments give containers or users more access than they should. So if one gets hacked, that attacker can go much deeper into the system because it has more access. Another area where we tend to see that is in cloud environments, right? They typically, and I guess part of it's just kind of it's a newer technology, but a lot of the you get too much access in the beginning, and that is definitely an area that can be very negative if it gets into the wrong hands. And then the third one is ignoring what's happening when it's running. So runtime means what's happening while the app is running. And if you're not watching that closely, attackers can run extra software like crypto mining or malware. So those are the kind of the three common mistakes that you want to make sure that you're not falling into if you're trying to run those types of environments.
Would those be very similar, not necessarily in how you do it, but to the challenges if you were running servers in the cloud or servers in your local environment?
Absolutely. I mean, it's very similar as far as, as I mentioned, like cloud environments typically have too much access. It's one of the things that we talk about quite often when we're giving advice to companies that are using cloud. Is first thing you should do is start to look at, providing more of a least access or the whatever's access is needed, and so yeah, absolutely.
So we've gone through a lot more technical data than we normally do on this, and I think it's all been great insights. But what are some of the ways you see all this actually playing out in the wild through threats or industry best practices?
So some of the things that we're seeing, ransomware. There was more ransomware in 2024 than there was, ever before, right? So that's still on an increase, and it ties directly into the ability to get into these machines, the ability to spread malware. So whenever you're hearing, and if it makes it in the news that, hey, this is ransomware, this took down a certain company or prevented them from doing business. The vulnerabilities we just talked about, there's a good chance that some of that was used. The SSH getting in or these bots that we were talking about that can spread the malware. So it definitely affects that. And we also need to keep in mind that when it comes to attacks like ransomware, there's constant evolving threats. There's constantly this idea that they're constantly looking at tuning and tweaking their attacks. An example of that was, when ransomware first came out, it was kind of a double extortion campaign where they're going to lock you out of your data and they're going to steal your data as well, so that they can threaten you and say, hey, you got to pay us or we're going to release this data out on the dark web or release this, in the public. And you need to pay us so that we'll give you the keys to be able to access your systems. And sometimes paying them worked and sometimes paying them and didn't work. Now we're seeing triple and quadruple extortion. And triple would be not only are they doing the first two steps, but they're also going to follow up with a DDoS attack. So while you're trying to figure out how to restore backups and how to recover from being locked out of your systems, here comes a DDoS attack, and that's just more pressure on a company. And then the fourth one, which is really interesting now, is attackers are going straight after your customer. So they steal your customer data. And then now that they've got the customer data, they contact the customer. And either they try to get the customer to put pressure on the company, or they extort directly the customer. So think about a scenario maybe where there's medical records, right? And somebody calls you up and says, hey, if you don't pay me, I'm going to release your medical records out in the public. that might motivate a lot of people to want to pay up at that point. So it's just constant evolution of threats. Sometimes it's just kind of doing the same old thing, but in a different way. And sometimes it's brand new.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges is, when we talk about business continuity, there are natural disasters. There's losing power, there's floods, there's hurricanes. There's things that could happen. But within cyber resiliency, it's an active thinking, iterating enemy. They're doing reconnaissance. They're iterating on their attacks. I know when I was back at one of the companies and I worked for previously, we saw, okay, we're getting a lot of attacks out of China and Russia and places like that. So let's block all access from those because we don't have any customers in those regions. Well, within 12 hours, they had shifted all their attack infrastructure to come out of the United States. And so then we had to say, okay, what's, next, let's block this protocol. And then they moved to another protocol. And it is that constant understanding, so there are some things that we need to do. Obviously, blocking certain, blocking or securing SSH, good first step. Looking at things like cross-site scripting and doing that more securely. But I think that second part you bring up is looking at that threat activity, understanding what the threat's doing, how they're iterating. DDoS, the same kind of thing within DDoS. We see them moving to not only different techniques, but different motivations. Have you seen much on that side?
Yeah, a lot in the last couple of months, actually. So we're tracking, a variant of Mirai that's able to generate between 5 and 6 terabits of attack traffic. We just mitigated an attack a couple of weeks ago against a gaming site that was 1 terabit per second. Well, that's a huge amount of traffic. And unfortunately, DDoS, it's an old strategy, but as the internet gets bigger and bigger, as far as more bandwidth is being added to it, it's getting easier and easier to bring bigger attacks to bear. So, when we look at like just even 1 terabit per second can cause an ISP, an internet service provider problems. It's definitely going to cause most companies out there problems. So we're just seeing bigger and bigger attacks, and we're seeing them more often. We're seeing them. I mentioned they're being added to ransomware. DDoS is a very common attack for hacktivists, and we're seeing a lot of hacktivist activity right now because of the geopolitical kind of state that we're in. And we've been seeing that for the last couple of years as we're seeing kind of conflicts in the world that generates an increase in cyber attacks.
Yeah, and I think that goes to exactly what I was talking about, that motivation.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things to talk about here is the concept of, a nation state actor and then a criminal and then that hybrid. It harkens back. Yes, I said harkens back to the privateer where, a pirate was commissioned by a state to be part of their armada. Now you have cyber criminals that are encouraged by the state for protection to act in political ways.
Yeah.
So as we think through all this, and I know a lot of this is tied to the research you are talking about, is tied to the protections. Walk me through some of the things that people should be doing, both on the tool sides and best practices side.
Sure. And I think we touched some on best practices. Obviously, for injections, if you're sanitizing your data, then that's going to, help with those vulnerabilities. There are, obviously you want a security control in front of, anything that's internet facing, and a web application firewall is kind of that default security control for applications, and it can catch that cross-site scripting that we talked about. It can identify that. It can identify injection attacks, and can also identify some of the any type of vulnerability that's application based. So when it comes to those types of how do you protect your application, there's definitely some best practices as far as sanitizing your data and making sure that things are locked down so that people can, not anybody can get to the servers from the inside, because now we're getting to a point where it's not a matter of when or if someone's going to get into your network. It's a matter of when.
I like to say it's a matter of how quickly you detect them.
Right.
It's, if I detect them in a half hour, it's an incident. If I detect them 6 months later, it's a breach.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing that, you can do is, and it's a zero trust principle, is segmentation. If we know, and we just said, if we know that they're going to get in, we want to limit what they can do. So kind of limit the blast radius of whatever impact they're able to do. And segmentation means that, we're taking a network environment and splitting it up into small security pieces, right? So that there are security checkpoints, in a sense, for moving from a laptop to a server. And at that point, you can actually enforce things like, hey, we're not gonna RDP to any of our servers, and I can enforce that with segmentation. So I can kind of keep that attacker in a segment versus being able to allow them to go after my critical applications. So segmentation is very important to that.
Yeah, I would agree. If you do have SSH ports opened, because that's what's required, and sometimes we do have to take risks because of our business model or a legacy application, then those should be segmented off. They should be monitored uniquely. They should have just anything that's kind of protected and monitored in a different way gives you so much more protection. So I think that's actually becoming more and more important and more complex. So how do you think about segmentation again when I've got servers, I've got cloud infrastructure, I've got Internet of Things because I have sales devices? How is all that working across all those environments?
So this is where our favorite word of the day, which is AI, comes into play. And there are solutions out there, especially software-based microsegmentation, that can actually do a lot of this heavy lifting for you. If you're looking at like a software-based solution, it's looking at all this communication. So basically, you install it and you let it listen. And then as it's listening, it's learning what is going on in your network. It's also able to identify common applications. So without you even having to tell it, it can say, hey, I recognize this accounting application. I see the front end of it, and I see the back end, and I see the database. And I've been watching it, and I understand the communication patterns, and I'll even recommend kind of the allow this, block this type approach. So I think to avoid the level of effort of trying to do this manually, which in many instances would be this monumental task, this is a great example where you lean on, machine learning, neural nets, even generative AI to help you identify everything in your network and start to be able to create segments based off of very logical things like, hey, this is an application, put a ring around it, right? This is where we keep PII information. We're going to do this. Or I need to separate my dev environment from my production environment, or my PCI, or whatever I need, high compliance, security on versus the rest of the network. It has the ability to kind of separate those out, and you have different rules for each piece.
Yeah, and I like the fact that if you have segmentation or whatever network monitoring, and if it has some of the AI that's natural language, you can go in and say, tell me wherever I have SSH throughout my network. And it'll bring it back to you. And then you can start to do other queries, like what protections do you have? Are they opened? Are they internet facing? And I would say probably 2-3 years ago, that would have required a tier 2 engineer in a lot of cases. to go through and manually figure that out or look at logs and so the more and more I look at new products or talk to my current vendors about their roadmap, I really am interested in a lot of that natural language query to understand where can I start to have, and again, skills are so hard to find. Finding, a security engineer that understands generative AI or even API or Kubernetes or pick your flavor of the latest infrastructure capability I'm moving towards. That is becoming more and more a common feature that I want to understand within my security capabilities. That's great advice.
Yeah.
What else?
Um, Along those lines, being proactive. We talked about some really low-hanging fruit, like having that SSH open. There's a lot of things you can do to be proactive to protect your environment, closing down those common ports that you're not using, those common protocols that you're not using. We talked a little bit about, hey, we're seeing ransomware using 3 very popular ports. Not saying that they don't use others, but those are the most popular. Well, if you know that and you're able to prevent that communication within your network, that's a very proactive approach that will stop attackers from being able to do that. And either it's going to force them to have to find some other way around it, or to go find another target, kind of depending on how much time and effort and how many tools they have in their tool bag to go after your environment. So there's a lot of things to kind of be proactive, and then making sure that you're identifying, if you have to be reactive, having that visibility into the network, very quickly being able to identify it, so that, as you mentioned, if I identify it quickly, it's a small issue. If I identify it 6 months later, it's a big issue. You want to be able to identify a lot of this stuff a lot quicker.
It's interesting to say. So I think I'm going to jump on top of like the 4 insights that were at the end of that. And that first one dovetails right into what you're saying, is that, implement basic cyber hygiene. It's so easy to say. It's like, use common sense. Well, common sense isn't that common.
Yeah.
It's do the fundamentals. Well, blocking and tackling, all those different ways to say it. It is so complex. There are so many things going on. How do you prioritize that? And that's where I love the fact that we've talked about a couple things to help me. If I want to prioritize where to do my proactive hygiene stuff, that risk scoring we talked about at the very beginning, that helps me focus in. The tools we talked about OWASP. Go into those 3 OWASP models and knock out those 30 things. If you have all 3 of those APIs, large language models, and web pages, knock those out. Focus on those. Hygiene is people, processes, and technology. We talked about cross-site scripting. You need to have the training so your people aren't doing poor coding practices. So that first one, I love to say, sounds easy. Oh, just do the basics, but it isn't.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we gloss over that we're also dealing with probably a group that is undermanned and they're constantly putting out fires. So when we're saying, hey, be proactive, to be realistic, sometimes that's a little harder to do.
Copious free time.
Yeah. Come in on the weekends.
You don't need to sleep.
Exactly.
So number 2 is layer your environment behind security platforms. So, we used to talk about defense in depth. I like the version about talking about deploying, not in depth, but across the attack lifecycle. The first ones that came out with the attack kill chain was Lockheed Martin. I actually like what MITRE's done a lot better. There are a series of steps from reconnaissance to initial access to lateral movement to exfilling data to, and if you go through that and you say, okay, I have 15 tools up here in preventing access, and I have no tools in stopping lateral movement, that doesn't seem like a great plan. And so when we talk about consistency layering, it's not only layering in defense, but layering across the attack chain that I think is a good way to ask yourself, how many opportunities do you have to disrupt that attacker?
Yep. Well, ideally, with having a security control at every step would be great, but there are definitely some critical ones that you want to make sure you definitely can do. And the MITRE ATT&CK framework does a really good job of kind of highlighting that. I would say sometimes I would even say don't get too involved with the techniques as much as the tactics, right? You know, when you get kind of overwhelmed with all the different types of techniques that attackers are using, sometimes you just need to take a step back and go, look, I know that they have to do lateral movement, or I know that they have to get into here. So I have security controls in here, and kind of let the solutions handle the techniques. You really need to be focusing on the tactics and making sure that you're putting that security control in front of the attacker, even after he gets past that first one.
And then the second part of that is that word platforms.
Yep.
I'm a big fan, and all my peers I talk to are trying to reduce the number of tools we have out there, rather than 75, 100 tools. If I can take it down to 50 tools that are integrated, one vendor that gives me 7 of the tools integrated in a platform, it reduces my vendor strain. I'm in fewer vendor contract negotiations. It reduces the engineers' deployment and maintenance and configuration challenges. I think that's huge. The next one is keep a laser sharp focus on business critical services. Again, you can't protect what you don't know about, and not everything is equal. My credit card data and the lunch menu are not the same. And it surprises me how many people put them under the same protection architecture and spend the same amount of money on protecting both those things equally. You've got to identify what's critical. I think you talked earlier about the small percentage based on that risk scoring of the critical ones, and that's what you need to put in a safe, not my coin collection. So, and obviously I didn't do a really good job. It was more of a hobby than a truly good coin collection, but we won't go there.
And to wrap it up, we go back to your coin collection.
And then finally, the trusted incident response team or partner. It's not if, it's how quickly you respond, how quickly you detect. And in the case where you've outsourced to a service provider, or somebody like DDoS protection, because I don't do that every day, so I have a specialty to do and something like that, you have to have process and coordination to do it well. So I would thank everybody for joining us today. Again, if you go Google Akamai Defender's Guide, it's a great report, great graphics. Please take a look at that. Some of the stuff we talked about today was out of our blogs and not the report, especially things like DDoS and ransomware. So if you go to Akamai blogs, I'm very proud of what we're putting out from our researchers there. But again, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it, and we look forward to engaging you again soon.
Thank you.